Chapter 14. The Cry of a Seabird. Lucretia Cutter stood in the doorway, motionless, like the angel of death. Novak cried out, gripping Darkus tightly. "I can explain," she gabbled. "I was making him fall in love with me for my acting. He wanted to see the house. I thought he would be impressed by the mirror. I didn't know you were working." Lucretia Cutter wasn't listening to her daughter. She was staring at Darkus. "I'll show him right out now, shall I?" Novak's voice was rising in pitch and volume. Lucretia Cutter finally spoke. "I think not." Novak gave a terrified squeak. Darkus felt like a rabbit trapped in the sights of a hungry hawk. He stared at the ground. "I've seen you before, boy, haven't I?" Darkus shook his head and kept his eyes on the floor. "What's your name?" Daniel Dowie, miss," he mumbled. Novak looked at him and then away. Lucretia Cutter moved her head, tipping first one ear up to the ceiling and then the other. "I see you've brought me a present, Daniel. How kind." Daniel looked up, confused, and she smiled at him, her mouth stretching freakishly wide across her face. His heart jumped up and down so hard inside his chest that he thought she must surely be able to hear it. Present? No, but you're wrong. Look." And she lifted the end of one of her sticks and pointed. "You've brought me a Calcosoma caucasus for my collection." Darkus looked, and there was Baxter standing proudly on his shoulder. He must have climbed from his broken jar and out of the top of the backpack. The Beetle was very still, his eyes fixed on Lucretia Cutter. Darkus clenched his fist. He wasn't going to let this woman come anywhere near Baxter. Novak suddenly launched herself at her mother, catching her off guard and pushing her backwards through the doorway. "Run! Run! Run!" she screamed, as she wrapped her arms around her mother's skirt, and they both fell to the ground in a tangle. Darkus bolted out of the door, and Baxter leapt into the air, flying at his shoulder. Out of the corner of his eye, Darkus saw two black claws kicking out of Lucretia Cutter's skirts. He raced down the hallway towards the lift, praying for it still to be there. A shocking, hissing sound exploded out of the room behind him. It was like the noise Baxter had made to ward off Robbie and the clones, only 100 times louder. The lift was there. Novak had left the gate open. Darkus hurled himself forwards, clattering into the lift, slamming his hands on all the buttons. Nothing happened. The gate! He had to close it. She was coming. Lucretia Cutter was impossibly tall. Her head brushed against the ceiling as she skittered towards him at horrific speed. Her arms thrown wide, an ebony cane pointed at him. Darkus froze in terror. There was an ear-shattering crack. Splinters of wood from the back wall of the lift sprayed against his neck, and Darkus stumbled forward in shock. She'd shot at him. Baxter rounded angrily, flying out of the lift straight at her. Lucretia Cutter swiping at the Beetle with one stick, trying to kill him, trying to hit him with the other as he circled round her head. "Ah!" she shrieked with rage as Baxter dragged all 6 of his sharp claws across her neck. Her canes fell to the floor as she lifted her left hand to cover the bleeding scratches, her right hand grabbing at the rhinoceros beetle. "I'll smash your eco-skeleton like an egg," she howled as she thrashed around. Baxter dodged about, flying at her face again and again with his horn down, hissing loudly. Darkus grabbed the brass lattice gate and slammed it shut. "Baxter!" he screamed, and the lift door started to close. "Baxter!" he cried again. The beetle looped up and flew back towards the lift just as the door shut and the box lurched, dropping down. When the lift stopped and the door opened again, Darkus pulled aside the grate and fell to his knees. His breath and his heart were all he could hear. He felt sick. What had happened to Novak? He thought about that blood-curdling, hissing noise, and Baxter was still up there with that monster of a woman. He shuddered. Whatever she wasn't human. The lift had come down, so that meant the way out must be 2 or 3 floors up. He pushed himself out of the lift and into the corridor, still on his hands and knees. The corridor was utilitarian and grey, a dark floor with a lighter shade on the walls. There were strip lights overhead. He had to keep moving. She had shot at him with her stick. How had she done that? Darkus was shaking. He thought about Uncle Max. "Grit and determination," he whispered. He heard a faint rattling sound, and his pulse jump-started, throbbing in his neck and temples as he tried to see where it was coming from. There was a clunk overhead, and he looked up to see Baxter clambering through a gap between the top of the lift and the door frame. "Baxter!" Warm relief flooded through his body, and his legs found the strength to stand. He reached up, and the beetle dropped onto his hand. He pulled Baxter in against his chest, curling his shoulders forward and whispering to him. Baxter stood upright, reaching his forearms up to rest against Darkus's jumper, returning the hug. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, putting Baxter on his shoulder where he belonged. Leaving the gate open so Lucretia Cutter couldn't use the lift, he set off down the corridor. Either side of it, at sporadic intervals, were numbered grey doors with small square shutters. He tried a few, but all the doors were locked. He guessed these were the cells that Novak had referred to. He needed to find a staircase to get him to the ground floor. Maybe he could just climb out of a window. Turning a corner, the hallway continued. To the right was a white door. He tried it and it opened. Cautiously peering in, Darkus saw a wall of subdued green light, divided into rectangles. He felt for the light switch, and the strip lights flickered on. The room was full of tanks and aquariums, each teeming with different species of beetle. "Baxter, look!" Darkus stepped forward, immediately recognising darkling beetles and Darwin's beetles, the rare chestnut-brown stag with mandibles as long as legs, making it look like a spider in armour. And in the middle of the wall of the aquariums, a tank full of yellow ladybirds the size of a 2-pence coin. So, the beetle in the museum had belonged to Lucretia Cutter. The sudden light startled the beetles, and they churned, excited to see who was responsible for the disturbance, running to the walls of their tanks and clawing at them. The Darwin beetles bashed their antlers against the glass as if trying to get at him. And a tank of vicious-looking giant tiger beetles screeched and gnashed their mandibles together threateningly. Darkus was shocked by the howling cacophony of hisses and chirps that rose out of the aquariums as the aggressive beetles threw themselves at the walls of their prisons, clambering over one another in their frenzied desire to get at him. These beetles were totally different from the ones in the mountain. His beetles at Nelson Parade were peaceful and calm. Darkus took another step forward to try and quieten the insects, but Baxter rose up off his shoulder and tugged at his jumper with his legs, pulling him away. The tank holding the Darwin's beetles shifted forward an inch and then another as a multitude of giant jaws hammered against the glass in unison. If it dropped off the shelf, the glass would smash and the beetles would escape. Darkus suddenly realised Baxter wasn't hissing back or readying himself to attack. He was trying to tell him to run away. The tank with the Darwins jumped forward again. Darkus span around and ran out of the door, back into the corridor. An eerie wail, like a distant call of a seabird, echoed up the hallway. The hairs on the back of Darkus's neck lifted and he shivered, but he couldn't go back. So taking a deep breath, he moved forwards towards the sound. He hoped fervently that he'd find a staircase before he encountered whatever was making the noise. But as he got closer, a tone in the mournful wail vibrated like a harp string in his chest. Tears sprang into his eyes and he started running. The sound was a man crying, and Darkus recognised that crying with every atom of his body. "Dad!" he shouted, and the crying stopped. "Dad!" "Darkus?" came a stunned reply from somewhere just ahead of him. It was the sound he'd craved for 6 tortuous weeks. He'd dreamt about it. Now he was really hearing it, and the sound of that one word set fire to his soul. "Dad!" Darkus cried out, running faster. Suddenly, a door to his left opened, and a pair of arms reached out and grabbed him. A hand covered his mouth, and an arm wrapped around his waist, lifting him off the floor. He tried to kick and cry out, but he wasn't strong enough. He was dragged backwards into a wine cellar. "Stop fighting me, boy. I've got to get you out of here before you get yourself killed." Darkus went limp. He recognised the French accent. It was the butler. Gerard let go and Darkus pulled away. "No, I'm not leaving. My dad's here. Darkus felt something strike him hard on the back of his head. His neck flamed hot and everything spun. "Forgive me," he heard the butler say as the world faded away. "Madame is coming, and she must not find you." Darkus felt something cold splash across his face. His eyes flickered open. His head was throbbing. "Listen, boy," said the voice of the butler. "You must get up. You are beside the servants' entrance to Towering Heights, at the side of the house." Darkus propped himself up on his elbows, confused. "Now, you must run. Do you hear me? I cannot assist you a second time." Before Darkus could reply, the butler had shut the door and he heard the key turn in the lock. "No!" Darkus knelt up and he beat his fists on the door. "No! Dad!" He sank down, his aching head in his hands. "Dad!" he sobbed. He felt a tickling sensation on his neck. Baxter had hidden down the back of his jumper and was climbing out. He reached round and picked up the beetle, holding him in front of his face. "Dad's in there, Baxter, and I don't know what to do." Baxter reared up on his back legs and he nudged Darcus's cheek with the side of his horn. "Psst!" Darcus froze. "Psst! Over here!" came a loud whisper. Darcus turned to see Virginia, hiding behind a row of flower pots full of the same red lilies he'd seen up by the front door. "It's me," she mouthed, looking worried. "Are you okay?" He nodded dumbly, feeling a rush of warmth. He'd never been so glad to see a friend. "I know you didn't want us to come, but we did anyway. Then I saw the butler lay you out on the floor like you were dead, and the gate opened for a delivery van, so I had to make sure you were—" "I'm alive," Darcus said, rubbing the tender lump on the back of his head. "Just." Virginia scurried over to him. "Great, let's get out of here. Can you walk?" "She's got him." Darcus's voice broke. "What?" "Dad. She's got Dad." His shoulders started shaking and he couldn't stop the hot tears spilling out of his eyes and rolling down his cheeks. "She's got my Dad." "Darcus," Virginia shook him. "Pull yourself together. Listen to me. Your dad needs you to be strong. I need you to be strong. Come on, please. You won't be able to rescue him if you get caught yourself." And she hauled him to his feet. "Now, follow me." They reached the corner of the building. The gate was still open and less than 20 metres away. Virginia peeked round to make sure the coast was clear. "Okay, we're going to run on 3. 1, 2. She suddenly stopped, pushing Darcus back against the wall. "Get out!" the Carisha cutter screamed as Pickering and Humphrey stumbled backwards out of towering heights. "We didn't bring a beetle," Pickering insisted. "We don't know any boys," Humphrey blustered. The Carisha cutter poked one of her sticks into Humphrey's spongy chest. "I'm coming to get my beetles. Tomorrow, first thing." "Tomorrow?" Pickering blinked. "But I thought—" "Tomorrow!" The doors slammed shut. The confused cousins stared at each other and then staggered down the path out of the gate, squabbling. 3! Virginia sprinted towards the closing gate and Darcus ran after her. They darted through just before it clanged shut.